When you think of a lifelong learner, what are those characteristics that you think are the most important that educators should be fostering?
I think the first one is that learning is part of your expectation of your development.
Yeah.
If you help the student normalize that, like, learning is actually part of your humanity, it's part of what you should be pursuing at all time, because there's a whole lot of knowledge out there. And if you can help the students recognize that, then it's gonna help them to realize that actually, learning is part of being a human.
Welcome to the Learning Success Podcast, brought to you by Deo Mwano Consultancy. I'm David, and this is Deo.
Hey, David, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm doing excellent. We are here to share our insights and experiences in order to support you as educators, to help drive student success. And we want to provide you with relevant information and insights in order to build a healthy learning environment. Today, we are talking about how to build lifelong learners beyond the classroom, from what we do in the classroom. We've got some great topics. We want to talk about the role of an educator. We want to talk about the importance of connecting students to what is beyond the classroom. And then at the end, I want to talk about some things that we personally are involved in now in our lives in order to continue our learning for ourselves. Mm-hmm. So first, Deo, I want to talk about the role of an educator, because we have sort of these two roles. So there's a lot of roles as an educator, but two big roles. We have our role in terms of our subject area. I was a math teacher, and I had objectives that I had to meet. There were tests I had to give, and I had to make sure that I was to a certain point at the end of the year. Students needed to be able to demonstrate knowledge on certain topics. But there's also this other role as an educator that I was trying to not just help students to remember the slope of a line or to be able to find the equation of a parabola. I was trying to build in those students the skills in order to be able to transfer the knowledge that they were learning in the classroom and transfer that outside of the classroom also. That involved being confident in themselves, having perseverance, having problem-solving skills that they could learn outside of the classroom. So maybe you could just kind of talk a little bit in terms of your own experience, Deo, the role of that educator, those two roles, the role of the actual material that you're teaching and how important that is, because that's a huge piece of what we're doing as educators, but also that bigger role as a teacher to conveying those skills that students will use outside the classroom.
Yeah, thank you, David. I'm excited for this topic because it takes learning outside of the box that sometimes the education institutions put it in. As a teacher, if you are aware of that, it makes the learning approach more holistic to help the students make that connection. In my experience as an educator, I've played different roles in my experience. So for about 13 years, I spent time at a K-12 after-school program with students from different schools, elementary, middle school, high school. And in that experience, I was a dance teacher. I ran special projects and programs helping students with their social and emotional learning. We ran an introduction to a nursing program. So I've had the opportunity to actually engage with students outside of the formality of a classroom for a very, very long time, and all very diverse type of students in terms of having English learner students, non-regular students in terms of that are not English learner students, different grade levels. And then on the other side of my education experience, I actually was a learning coach at a higher education program for 5 years, where I helped develop a coaching model to coach adult learners that were going back to school to try to earn their college degree after being in the workforce for a very long time. And a lot of my work through that experience focused a lot on resiliency, looking at relevancy between the learning outcomes and the learning deliverables and the everyday experience of the students working for their employer. So making that connection. So, and then I contributed a lot in a technology tool that we were building at the time around the student success aspect of things. So that's my background in terms of, and I've also taught special courses at that fuses dance and history and practice in a special environment for college students. I've also done it in boarding school, working with 9th to 12th graders. So that's my background. So I wanted to give the learner, our listeners, some perspective of where our conversation comes from. And you've also had over a decade of teaching experiences. So when we talk about the importance of a learner really having a mindset of continuation of learning beyond the classroom and how it comes from the teacher, I think it's important. I always say relevance. You got to figure out what's the connection that you can help the students make between what's happening in the classroom and what they might be interested in, or where they spend their time outside of the classroom, so they can see the connection around it. Or sometimes it might not even be based on what they do outside of the classroom, but how it ties to the greater society, right? Like for instance, today, we've seen a really huge evolution around AI where AI is moving super, super fast. And we actually had a podcast recently that we focused on AI. We focused on technology adoption, not specifically AI, but and students are very socially connected to different technology platforms as well. So as a teacher, if you understand all these moving parts of where students spend their time outside of school, you can make connection to what they're learning, and or even the approach in which they acquire information and learning to some of those extracurricular things that they do, or just the evolution of our society. Because I think if you can make that connection, students might find the importance of how what they're learning translates outside of the classroom, but also for them to take ownership of continuing to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. It made me think of, I just read an article about data science and how data science should be all over our curriculums in schools because of because of AI and data science, all those applications that students can connect what's happening in their everyday life with what's happening in the classroom. And I think it's so important. It's so important that we have those undertones of, we're learning this for a purpose. There's a greater good here. Even when I've done tutoring before, I always try to think of like the connection of like, because a student, when you're tutoring, they want to get whatever it is that is in front of them done. But I'm always trying to connect that of like, well, what about this? Or think about the greater purpose of what it is that they're doing. And I think that's so important as educators, because if not, you're just, what you're showing, what you're teaching doesn't have any importance. It's not going to have that meaning. It's going to be lost, and students are going to find other places where other material that does connect to their lives. And I think that there is such a strong connection, especially in mathematics. I'll speak to mathematics. You mentioned, I was a math teacher for over 10 years, and the world looks very, very different 10 years ago that when I started than it does now. And it's important to find those connections because that's why we're doing it. That's what's actually happening. Well, maybe we could talk next about some of the characteristics of a lifelong learner. Kind of maybe talk a little more specifically about, when you think of a lifelong learner, what are those, top 3 or top 5, whatever it might be? What are those characteristics that you think are the most important that educators should be fostering?
Yeah, so I think the first one is that that learning is part of your expectation of your development.
Yeah.
Right? Like, because if you expect that, like, if you help the student normalize that, like, learning is actually part of your humanity. It's part of what you should be pursuing at all time, because there's a whole lot of knowledge out there. We don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
And if you can help the students recognize that, then it's going to help them to realize that actually, yeah, learning is part of being a human.
Yeah, it's huge.
You know? And I also think that there is a opportunity to separate like the assessment part of things than just learning. Because I feel like in the education space, students connect learning to results because that's how they've been measured since pre-K, right?
Yeah.
So you got to be able to differentiate that and separate it and have a really clear distinction of that you can learn without getting quote unquote assessed, at least in the traditional way of what assessment is. Because you can demonstrate what you've acquired, right? And not get assessed, right? Like if you think about outside of the classroom environment, when people are learning something in order to be able to show something or create something, it's not like a teacher's coming back to assess it. Like your level of assessment is really, did it work? Did I put it together the right way?
Right.
You know, and we can go on and give variation of examples of some of the outcomes in terms of what you're acquiring. But there's also a thing of like acquiring knowledge in order to assess your preconceived knowledge too, right?
Yeah.
And I think that one is a little bit harder sometimes because people are less open sometimes to change their mindset based on new information they've learned, where it's more like protecting what I've already been taught or what I know. And I think there's a great opportunity for teachers to be able to help students realize that, right? Like part of critical thinking and critical assessment is being able to look at things within its face value, and in order to figure out how do those things come to be and what are the influences around those things. And I think that sometimes is much harder to teach because you know, we're living in the world where there's so many different ideology now, and sometimes those ideologies compete with one another, and teachers rather walk a very fine line and not, you know, try to, you know, ruffle any feather but like you should also be able to learn just for the sake of challenging your own perspective and point of views. You know, and I think that's a different category than, hey, I'm learning how to do this so I can do that. I'm learning how to do this. Sometimes you learn so you can figure out, you know, I've been so definite around certain point of views that I have because of this, and I want to challenge it, right? So part of that journey is to throw other stuff against it in order to see, you know, where there's correlations or where there's distinction or where there's opportunity too, you know? And I think good educators are able to do that, especially how they present history or new formula or and I think the piece that's interesting is there's also more and more tools now too, to be able to learn without needing that transactional relationship of a teacher, right? We have all the chat GPTs. We have even Google, right? YouTube, the great university of YouTube, right? Like there's so many different platforms and places for folks to get information and learn about stuff. So going back to that life learner, the importance of that, it's for the teachers to constantly map the possibility and the options to the students. And if you can make the connection to them, then they'll be able to realize it. And sometimes it's not even just introducing new things. Sometimes it's about polling from the students in order for you to recognize and realize how they're going about learning and how they're going about showing, and then for you to elevate it, right? Because if I went to you and I said, hey, David, we give this example often. Like, when was the last time you learned something new? How did you feel about it? Why did you want to learn the thing? What's it been like? Have you been able to show that you've acquired the knowledge, right? And whatever you shared with me, I can even get you excited about it. Like if I say, I was like, you did what? You learned how to, that's amazing. You allocated time to learn that thing? And do you have a deliverable? What was the thing? Right? And he's like, oh, I made this thing. Oh, I did this. Wow, that's incredible. That's awesome. Are you still doing it? Right? Like that just my curiosity around your process, it will get somebody excited. right? So those are like, there's so many different tricks and tools that you can utilize to help take those experiences outside of the classroom. And I think, that excitement and the encouragement can go a long way.
Yeah.
Because some students, they want validation, not just through a type of grade that they get. They want validation through the curiosity of the teacher in terms of what their experience is like.
Exactly. And that's what's contagious. That's what kind of carries on. I mean, when I think about characteristics, you mentioned resources, and I think that that's huge. Like I used to talk to my students all the time about, because especially in math, students would say, well, how do I do this problem? Mm-hmm. And then, they need some explanation or but then the question is just like, okay, but how about this next one? How do I do that one? And, I try to focus a lot in my classes and just the world that we live in, because there are so many resources of where would you go if I wasn't here? Mm-hmm. Trying to develop that in students of what resources do you have in order to push you farther towards a solution. I think resources are so important, especially in our world today, when we have those resources right at our fingertips. We have those resources there. But I think the second one, and you mentioned AI, we've talked about AI before. We talk about AI a lot, mm-hmm. and how it's beneficial for the classroom and how it's so important that we incorporate that into our lives, because AI is producing a lot of things in our world. And I think it's important also to help students to have a method of checking that, of going that one step farther, of saying, okay, whatever that was, how are you going to verify that some other way? Mm-hmm. Just because you see it on YouTube, just because you see it on a web page, or just because, what else is that? I've seen students that will Google something very quickly or use something on ChatGPT very quickly, and they will take that at face value. And so being able to help them to see like that actually is not correct, or mm-hmm. that is misinformation. And I think that that's important as a lifelong learner, to not only seek those resources, but actually check those resources against something else. And then something else you mentioned too, which was feedback, which is huge. I think being able to incorporate feedback and talk to people about your thoughts or your thought process, and getting feedback and incorporating that is so important, because you may have a very good perspective, but oftentimes you're missing something. Mm-hmm. And so by getting other people's perspective, I think it really develops you as a very, very good, a very good lifelong learner. It's somebody that will spend their whole life learning something new, because that is what it's all about. There's always something else to learn. You're never going to reach that point. I've had quite a few students at the college level who have approached me and asked me and said, I want to know everything. Mm-hmm. How do I are there resources that I can, and I always talk to them and I say, well, you can learn a lot. You can spend your whole life learning mathematics. Mm-hmm. But the most important thing, and if I can help you now as a young student, if I can help you now to realize that the point of all this is not to reach the end of knowledge, because you'll never do that. Mm-hmm. And that's not the way this works, but it's to actually understand that there's always one more thing to learn. There's always another thing that you can that you can incorporate into your life. Another example, just from my own personal experience, when mm-hmm. I was in the United States Peace Corps, and I lived in Ecuador, and as a part of that, I was a part of a language training program, and I had some Spanish going down, but there was a lot to learn, and I too was in the mindset of I just need to know everything. Mm-hmm. At some point during this training, I will reach the status of knowing every single thing there is to know about Spanish, and I will be fluent, and that's how it works. And a friend of mine who had already gone to their placement at their site came back, and they had a very, very high level of Spanish. They were what I would consider fluent in Spanish, non-native speaker, but they were fluent. And they came back with a story, and he was very confident, got off the bus, and there was these students speaking, and he didn't understand anything they were saying because it was a local dialect. It was a local, they were using local slang. They were children. He wasn't like, and so he was like off put by this, and he was bringing this back saying, hey, and it was at that point that I realized, like, you know what, having that mindset where I always need to make sure that I'm in a place where I'm just learning something else rather than cutting that off and saying I've now understood everything. And I think that that's so important to help students is to see that this is a journey that is made one step at a time, and that journey doesn't end. There's always another path to take as you go. Well, let's talk about some of the diverse options beyond the classroom, right? Because this is, the world we live in. There are many diverse options that are really quite amazing beyond the classroom. There are colleges or other educational programs that students can be a part of.
YouTube University, yeah.
Yeah, there are trades that students can begin working even in high school, and after they graduate, they can do these programs. There are numerous. There's a 9-to-5 job. There's gig opportunities. These diverse options, how can we help to develop students for what maybe they don't even know they might do? How can we as educators posture ourselves? I'll be honest, I kind of struggle with that as a teacher. I'm teaching math. I'm teaching students, at a high level of, students that essentially, when students say, when are you going to need to know, I'm thinking, well, the material itself, like this is, maybe if you're an engineering student, you might use this, but otherwise this might not be something, it's probably not something that you're going to be using on a day-to-day basis. How do we posture ourselves as educators to make sure that we're helping a diverse population of students that are going to do so many different things when they graduate or leave our classrooms?
I would say there's a couple of things. I think one is definitely helping to infuse curiosity. I think that's really, really important. But I also think that it's also really important to help students understand kind of the fundamental that builds upon each other. And obviously, I think a lot of approach that K-12 has really focuses on those, especially on the K-5 level. There's a lot of fundamental thing that they're trying to instill in students so that they can build on one another. And I feel like sometimes fundamentals are not fully presented in a way where students can make connections to it, that like this builds on each other. Right. Because a lot of these things are kind of the structure that the foundation is built from. Yeah. And if you don't understand the foundation, then it's much harder to understand something on the other end of it. So I think, so for instance, like I remember when I was in college, I took a bunch of scientific method class because in my undergrad, I was preparing for a thesis, and I couldn't get to the thesis class until I did research method. I also took a scientific method class too, but I did two years of research method where I had to develop a thesis. But like in a lot of the work that I do today, I mean, we develop thesis on a weekly basis. Yeah. And we have to present it to our partners in order to get them to understand what the position is, right? And some of those theses, it's not even us, it's what we're gathering from their experiences, right? So, and then you also have to look at like evidence-based data or evidence-based research. What does that even mean, right? Yeah. But we do that all the time in our consulting work, where we have to look at, okay, how do we go back in order to identify if this data is valid or not based on the experience of what's occurring, right? So there's all this cross references that we need to do in order to figure out, is this one person's experience, or is it multiple people's experience? Is it something that's happening every year? Is it something that's happening during this season, this week, right? Because that will also determine what type of intervention you have to put in place. So that's what I mean by foundation. Like you need some foundational knowledge that you build from. And I think it's important for educators to be able to show students set. Because sometimes people they envision themselves with the end goal.
Yeah.
But sometimes they don't understand what foundational thing that they need to do.
Yeah.
Right. So for instance, like you're like, if you don't have a good work ethic behavior, right? Regardless of how intentional you are around the idea of trying to achieve that particular thing, the work ethic is what relates to the work you need to do in order to achieve and get to where you want to be.
Yeah.
So if you have it, and if you don't have it, you need to develop it, because that's going to be the thing that's going to hold you back from getting to, right? So I do think that, like, and part of it goes very similar to the podcast that we had, the previous podcast, where we were talking about resiliency, right? Endurance. Like, you have to be able to help the students understand that what the journey is holistically, so then they can engage fully, so then they can get to the place where they want to be at. Because there are some of these fundamental things that the school might teach or the education might teach, you're going to need an element of that when you're engaging in the learning outside of the classroom, or when eventually you start working for someone, right?
Right.
And I think and that's what I was saying about relevance. Sometimes it's missed. It's more pointed towards the direct intersection that lies right now, right? You know what I mean? What you're being measured right now and how it matches the test or the quiz or the project, versus, hey, if you work for someone, you're going to need to know you're going to need to know how to manage people's emotions. Right. You're going to need to know how to, maybe basic math, right? You're going to need to know time management, right? How to read the time, how to read the clock, right? So there's certain things that you need some sort of an element behind, so you can compete, right? Because if you don't have a baseline, it's really tough. You need to understand the importance of that. And I think educators can really help to make that connection between what you're doing in the classroom and how it benefits outside of the classroom. Right. And sometimes you might learn, maybe it's a challenging topic. Right. You might never use that topic outside of that classroom, but the grit that you develop. Exactly. Right. You're like, oh man, like I went into this, I know I'm probably never going to use calculus, but the process that I develop around tackling this challenge has helped me to develop the resilient, where if I go through another thing that I have to learn that's difficult, I'll be able to tap into the same, tools that I use in order to overcome, my fear that I had around calculus, right? Like, so sometimes, like, an example, even as a father, like, there are certain things that I witness with my children where I'm like, oh yeah, we can give them an easy way out to this thing. But I'm like, oh no, this is a resilient opportunity. This is a grit opportunity. So I might sit there for a little bit with them through that process, because I know if they endure this now, they're going to be much stronger. And then when another experience comes up, they're going to be able to tap into the experience that they had where they were able to overcome this, right? So I think it's the same way. And I know it's a lot of expectation to put on a teacher, where they have to measure what's the opportunity here, and how do I get the students to make connection to this opportunity in order to allow them to, 1, not give up, 2, show up, 3, endure the process, so then they can learn on the back end, right? But that's the experience, though. You know what I mean? Like that's why this exists. That's why, and I think when you also see how, when you think about the development of the human experience, it's building blocks, right? We started somewhere, and then we learned this, and then we started somewhere and we learned this, and then, but all of that is a building block to where we are now in the society that we've created, where 8 billion people live in, right? So, and so there's really clever ways to make those connections, to help folks. But I think it's a journey. And I think it's an important thing to do to help the students make that connection outside of the classroom.
Awesome. We have just like 1 minute, 1 or 2 minutes left. So I'm going to put you on the spot. In terms of connecting what happens inside the classroom and outside the classroom, what would you say to students? What would you say to teachers? And then what would you say to parents? You mentioned you're a parent. What would you say first to students?
It's your journey. Take ownership. There's so many times where I've done workshops and training with students in a cafeteria or in an auditorium, and I ask the question, who owns your learning success? 95% of the time they say teachers. It's your journey. You own your learning success.
Awesome.
Take ownership.
What would you say to teachers?
Teachers, I would say inspire and motivate. You want to inspire your students and motivate them. If you can find where the connection is to spark that ignition, and then the motivation is keeping that fire going, that's what it's all about.
And lastly, what would you say to parents?
Yeah, so for parents, I would say definitely celebrate and acknowledge your children. They need to be championed, right? And that's the closest intersection that they have to themselves is you. And being able to celebrate them and acknowledging the different moving parts that's occurring in their learning journey, it will go a long way.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Deo. Thank you for listening. If you found something helpful, please share it with a colleague, and we would love to hear from you. So please leave a comment. We would love to hear your perspective on this topic as well. Thank you so much.